Okay, so let's look at chapter, when I say it was 23, 24, about instrumental music. And so we've talked about, as we mentioned, the Lord's Supper, but we do want to talk about, and I think it's one of the most important ones, instrumental music. Now I'm going to introduce the topic this way, that the instrument of music was introduced into the churches of Christ into in the period right before the Civil War, right in the 1850s. And in the 1860s, it kind of began to flourish. And there was a church in Kentucky by the name of, it was in Midway, Kentucky. And the preacher there was named L.L. Pinkerton. L.L. Pinkerton introduced the instrument of music into Midway, Kentucky. And today, if you go there, it is a Christian church today, Christian church denomination. They still show the little melodeon that was there and they tell the story how it happened. But here's the background to it. So the singing was deplorable in the congregation. And so they said, well, we need some help with our singing. And so consequently, on Saturday evenings, they would gather together and at someone's house, and then they would practice their singing, but they thought, well, we're still not getting the pitch correctly. So they had the melodeon play, and they had a woman playing the melodeon. Finally, they said, well, if we can do it here, acceptable to God, of course, that's the issue, then we can take it into the building. So they did. They took it to the building, and as far as we know, and L.L. Pinkerton would say, as far as we're able to discern, this is the first Church of Christ that introduced us the instrument of music into the worship assembly. But it did cause a great stink. It caused a great furor in the church and in other places in Kentucky as well as also all across the country as it began to be introduced into many different places. There was an older elder at that congregation, and his name was Hibbler, and he had a slave, a black slave, and they snuck in one night into the church building at Midway. They stole that melodeon. They took it out of there. He said, we can't have musical instruments. They took it out. They put it in his attic, in his farm. But the church, of course, simply purchased another one, and they brought it in, and the church ended up splitting. Years later, guess what was found in that old attic? And that was the old original melodeon. So today, if you go to Midway, Kentucky, at the Christian church, they're going to show you this melodeon, saying, here is the melodeon. And one of the guides had said this to one of our preachers was there taking the tour. One of the guides said, well, you know, it's a shame that such a small thing can split such a great brotherhood as this. And our preacher responded, well, you know, it's no bigger than the idol of Baal. And that's exactly right. It's just the same thing as an idol of Baal. That is, in the sense, it's not about the size, it's about the principle involved. The same thing happened in the state of Texas, the great state of Texas here. So instrumental music began to be introduced in many different locations, many different churches, and so it was a big bone of contention, and so churches began to split. So consequently, there was a school, and it was right down here nearby where Kelsey lives. What's the name of that? No, the little town we went to. No. Nice try. No. Little community. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Yeah, that's right. And I've forgotten the name of it. But anyway, there was a school there called Ad-Ran Christian College. Addison Clark and Randolph Clark were brothers. And they were preachers of the gospel. Their father, Joe, was an old man, had a long white beard. And so they opened this college up in the about 1873, and they wanted to have a school for preachers as well as young women and to teach them the Bible. So they had a great college, Thorpe Springs, the name of it, Thorpe Spring. So they called it Ad-Ran Christian College, Ad-Ran. So everything rocked along. They had the student body grew to about 445. That would be about December time, about this time of year. As the school year began in September, when the boys were still in the field working, the enrollment would be maybe in the 40s and 50s. But as the fall came about, cold weather came, then the enrollment picked up, and they had one year in 1893, they had 445 students at the school. And they built different buildings. And it was just growing splendidly. But things began to happen. So in I think it was 94, they were going to have a preacher there by the name of B.B. Sanders. And B.B. Sanders, it was well known, was sympathetic to the instrument of music. And consequently, when B.B. Sanders, the gospel meeting came, it was in February of that year. They had an older building that they closed the windows at this point because it was chilly outside, but the building was packed. There's so many people in it. And so Addison, the president of the school, Randolph, the vice president, was sitting on the front row, and old Joe and his wife were up here. And so as the services began, Addison Clark stood up to begin and welcome the visitors and so forth. And old man Joe stood up with a petition, and it was a piece of paper, it was a petition. There was on the stage a melodeon, and there was a woman sitting at it named Bertha. And so they got up, old Joe got up, he came up on his cane, he handed the note to his son Addison. And the note, he got down, came down, he read it, got down, and conferred with his brother. And so Randolph, he and his brother Randolph were discussing it. The note read, "We cannot worship with the instrument of music before God conscientiously at all. Please do not use the instrument of music in worship at this particular occasion." So Addison and Randolph talked about it a little bit. Addison got up and he said this. He said, "You know what, and they had probably several hundred people that were there, packed in there. He said, "My father has given us a petition. Please do not use the instrument of music in this worship assembly. We cannot worship conscientiously with it. However, we have promised the students that we're going to use the instrument of music. The young people here want the instrument of music. So we've made that promise, and we cannot take back our promise." So he turned to the organist and said, "Play on, Miss Bertha," and she began to play. Old man Joe got up, he's on his cane, and he just started walking. His wife followed him. People started crying, and over 100 members left that morning. And the church split there. That was the background of Adran College. Adran College moved locations after that. They continued with instrumental music. They moved locations to another place, and that was over in Waco. They went to Waco. They went to a couple other towns. They set up the college, but finally they ended up in Fort Worth, and they called it now Texas Christian University, and that's the background of TCU. It began as a school set up for preachers and young women in the churches of Christ in the 1870s by Addison Clark and Randolph Clark. But today it is Texas Christian University. But what happened was that people realized at that point that the church could not survive by instrumental music being inserted into the worship assembly. And consequently, people split because people have conscientious objections to it. But in spite of those objections, in spite of the tender consciences that would bring tears to their eyes, we're going to do it anyway. J.W. McGarvey, an old-time preacher, was in Lexington, Kentucky. McGarvey was the most genteel Southern preacher, a great scholar. He was counted to be, in England, the greatest scholar on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, greatest Bible scholar. They said he was the greatest Bible scholar. He wrote commentaries. His commentary on the book of Acts we still use it today. Just a great, great writer, great scholar, just a gentle man. He got up in his congregation, and they wanted to use the melodeon. He said, "Please do not bring in the melodeon." But the young people wanted the melodeon. And so with tears in his eyes, he left the congregation and went to another one in Lexington. But the same scene took place at that congregation as well, as the instrument began to go and be inserted into many different churches all over the brotherhood. And finally, the split was became manifest actually by 1906. And it was only by the United States Census, because the United States government wrote to J.W. Shepard, who was the Gospel Advocate editor at the time, in 1906 and said, how many members do you reckon there are in the churches of Christ? He said, you know what, we're really two bodies. There are churches of Christ and there are Christian churches. And in the Christian churches, there were, I don't remember the numbers, but there was 9 members to 1. We lost almost all of the churches, all of the members, all of the doctors, the lawyers and such. They went with the instrument of music, and our brethren were left to go find another place to worship. And so they went to the other side of the tracks and they opened up little church houses somewhere else. And what happened with the Christian church at that time, between the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, we began to evangelize, we began to preach, and the churches of Christ began to grow. The Christian church went down the path of denominationalism, and it split in the 1960s between the Christian church, which is today called the Independent Christian Church, more conservative branch, and the Disciples of Christ, one of which was sitting right over here in the street, right next to us, Disciples of Christ. And that happened in the 1960s. They were a more liberal branch, and they took a more liberal view of everything in the Bible. That's the background of what has happened in the churches of Christ. And in all of that, the defenders of instrumental music have always relied upon and only relied upon 4 different arguments. Only 4 to justify the use of the instrument of music in worship. And they're right on the screen in front of you. Number 1, to justify the instrument, they would say, well, instruments were used in the Old Testament. David used instruments. And today we hear people saying, well, Psalms 150, praise him with the pipe, praise him with the harp, praise him with the trumpet. So we have praise in the Old Testament with the instrument of music. Number 2 is the solo argument. Solo, what is solo? Solo means, it's translated to make melody. So if you have your Bible, you might just notice Ephesians 5 and 19. We'll come back to answering these in just a moment. Ephesians 5 and verse 19. Here we have the statement made by Paul commanding them upon this occasion. Verse 18, be not drunk with wine, wherein is riot, but be filled with the Spirit. That is, I take it, that is, use your spiritual gifts, speaking one to another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody. So the words making melody translates from one Greek word, psallo, P-S-A-L-L-O, which means to pluck or to twang. Sometimes it is used in Greek language to refer to spit, hitting on the sidewalk when someone spits. Okay, that's psallo, pluck or to twang. Make melody in your heart to the Lord. So the argument shifted from the Old Testament argument to psallo. And so in the 1920s, when N.B. Hardeman had a debate that was really a nationwide event, because the brotherhood all over the country paid attention to what was going on, Ira Boswell, who was a Christian church preacher, this was his argument. Well, psallo, we have an instrument. It means pluck or to twang the strings of. Pluck or to twang. So therefore, we have instrumental music. But they abandon that argument, and then they go to the aid argument. Well, instrumental music is not necessarily commanded, but it is an aid. It's only an aid to us, just like you have songbooks, just like you have pews, just like we have a church building, and so the instrument of music is only an aid to help us along in singing. Today, however, you do not find any of the Christian church preachers or any preachers whatsoever really arguing from these standpoints at all, unless they're really behind the times. Because today the argument is that there is no authority for anything, or that I should say there's no pattern for anything, no pattern whatsoever. We don't need to pay attention to any kind of pattern. There is no guide in the New Testament to how to worship. None. That's how Given Blakely, Christian church, independent Christian church preacher, argued with Alan Hires in the 1980s in a famous debate in Missouri. And that's where they are today. There's no pattern whatsoever in the New Testament. How you want to worship is how you want to worship. So there we have the outline of it. All right, a lot of background, a lot of material there. So let's think about those four arguments. Anything you want to say and add before we examine these different positions, the different things here? All right, there is, yes ma'am. Yeah, that's true. What would Jesus have done? They will say, well, he would use the instrument of music. That's what they would say. He went to the temple and they worshiped the instrumental music. That's what they'll say. That's what they'll say to you. He went to the temple. He worshiped with animal sacrifices, instrumental music. Right? That's right. So let's look at this is page 176. There are 9 passages in the New Testament. Let's just set the table here even more so. There are 9 passages in the New Testament that mention music. 9. And here they are. So let's see what we have. Matthew 26 and verse 30 is number 1. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. That's Jesus and the apostles sung a hymn. Number 2, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns unto God. That's when they were in jail in Philippi. That's Acts 16. Number 3, we're page 176. This is Romans 15 and 9. Therefore will I give praise unto thee among the Gentiles and sing unto thy name. Number 4, 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 15. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. Number 5 is this passage in Ephesians 5:19. We'll be there. We'll camp there for just a few moments later. So if you want to turn there, you can see this one. Speaking one to another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Number 6, the parallel passage with Ephesians 5 is Colossians 3, and here it is. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing. Now this time, instead of making melody, it says with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Number 7, this is a prophecy regarding Christ quoted in Hebrews chapter 2. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing thy praise. Number 8, Hebrews 13 and 15. Through him, then, let us offer up a sacrifice of praise to God continually, that is, the fruit of lips, which give confession to his name. And then finally, James 5 and 13, is anyone suffering? Let him pray. Is any cheerful? Let him sing praise. So what do we note about those passages? All 9 mention vocal, a cappella, music only. That's all we have. Our brethren have argued, in spite of no matter where they may go, no matter what argument they bring forward, we've argued only one thing. There is no authority for instrumental music in worship, period. Our brethren have never changed from that argumentation. We've never strayed from that position. We've stayed right there. There's no authority. When you come down to the last one, there's no pattern. That is to say, well, you don't need authority. You don't need authority to do anything. And that's where they are today. But there's no authority for instrumental music. So we see those 9 passages. What we see about them is they all mention singing and singing only. As a matter of fact, if you go look at church history, which is not essential to make this argumentation, but in the first several centuries, up to the 5th century, there was no such thing as an instrumental music. And when Pope Gregory, that's right, you heard me correctly, Pope, the Catholic Church, Gregory introduced instruments of music into the Catholic ritual, there was over a century of fighting because they said, this is not in the New Testament. But that didn't matter because the Roman Church's position is that we have just as much authority as the New Testament, and we will tell you what the New Testament means. So authority comes from the Bible and tradition is what we say it is. And that's the Catholic Church's position. That's their official position. So that's how they handled it. Gregory the number 1 introduced it into churches. And since then, in the Reformation period, how did it get in all the churches around us? Because they came out of Catholicism and they never left the front yard. That's right. They didn't leave the front yard. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the Baptist church, the Presbyterian church, the Episcopal church. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the Lutheran church, all those high churches, or Pentecostal churches. They've all carried with them baggage from Roman Catholicism. And that's not the only baggage from Catholicism that they've carried. Such things as we have clergy and laity. Where does that come from? Catholic Church. You heard about clergy and laity? How about the pastor? Where does that come from? One man clergy, rest are laity. The distinction comes from Catholicism. It's not in the New Testament. This is why men such as Alexander Campbell said, let's sweep away all of this. Let's just go back all the way to Jerusalem. Let's just go to the Bible and see what we have in the Bible. Can we do that? Let's just do that. And that's what we're about. All right, so that's some background to it. Showed you the 4 different arguments that are used. Let's talk about each of them in order for just a moment. All right, so let's go to the Old Testament argument. Jan mentioned what Christ did going into the temple. And so it is stated, okay, in the Old Testament they used instruments of music to worship. No one denies that that be the case. Well, what is the answer to that? What is a simple, clear answer to that? God changed it. We're not under the Old Testament system any longer. The Old Testament law was nailed to the cross, Colossians 2. They also offered animal sacrifices. Are we to do that? Would anybody object if we did that today and said they did it and David did it? How about dancing and playing the flute as you jump around the building? David did that kind of thing. Are we going to follow that? They did a lot of things in the Old Testament. They had a priestly system and the clergy laity. By the way, where did the Catholic Church go to find clergy laity distinction? Old Testament. If you don't find it in the New, you run as fast as your legs can carry you back to the Old. Say, here's what they did in the Old Testament. This is how they worship back here. Let's do it this way. But that, of course, is not sufficient because the law was nailed to the cross, Colossians 2:14, and we are not under Old Testament worship. We're under the New Testament reality. And by the way, according to John 4, all of those things were simply types and shadows of the realities that we have now in Christ. The Old Testament argument, therefore, because that is so clearly seen, and their debaters dropped that argument by the 1900s, early 1900s, they dropped the Old Testament argument. They don't even argue that today anymore. Now today, you might hear people saying that, but that's because they're unschooled and where the drift has gone. In the 1920s, 1930s, the argument became, okay, well, solo. Okay, let's look at that passage in Ephesians 5 and 19. And here's the word, we're commanded to pluck the strings of, make melody. You see that? And that is the word solo. So we're in Ephesians 5 and the verses 19. So he tells us, speak one to another in psalms. Okay, he tells us what kind of songs to sing. Psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. We're not going to sing, other songs like Come Down South with the Banjo on My Knee. That's not the kind of songs we sing in worship. Spiritual songs and psalms and hymns, those would be psalms of David, put to music. That's what we do today. Then we have singing. There we have participating. By the way, let's just stop there for a moment. Is everyone to sing? Yes. What about the statement, I just don't have a good voice? God didn't ask you to have a good voice. He's not requiring you to have melodic sound. You need to sing. That's what he tells you to do. That's singing. He's not grading you on how you should sound. He's grading you on whether you participate. Participation. Singing. Then we have pluck the strings of, making melody. There's the word solo. That's the word. All right, solo. So Ira Boswell argued in the 1920s in his debate with Hardeman, and he said, solo means you have to pluck the strings of a harp or a guitar or tinkle the keys of the piano. That's what solo means. Say again. Well, he says the word solo, Greek word number 2, the Greek word solo means pluck the strings of. Well, it does mean that. It's not, we're not going to say, I'm not going to say, okay, just the word making melody. Just take the words making melody, comes from the Greek word solo. Solo means pluck the strings of. So David would solo the guitar. He would solo the harp. So here it says solo. All right, what about that? I want you to notice that he not only tells us to solo, pluck the strings, but he gives you the instrument that you're to use. Your heart. That's correct, your heart. I'm to pluck the strings of the harp? No. The piano? No. Am I to pluck the strings of a guitar? No. I'm to pluck the strings. He tells you exactly what you're to pluck the strings of, your heart. In other words, he's using symbolic language to tell you to engage with your heart. That which proves too much proves nothing. Not only that, but every member must pluck the strings of their heart. It does no good for Miss Bertha to sit up here and play a piano and everybody to listen and raise their hands and sway around, and that's worship. No, it is not. It is not worship. That is entertainment. And that is not obedience to the command. He says, every one of you pluck the strings of your heart as you sing. Engage with your heart. There's the instrument you're to use. And it doesn't do any good for someone to pluck the strings of something and satisfy the command that's given to you, to me. No, I'm commanded to do it. So that's for that reason, and that's what Brother Hardiman would argue, is say, look, that which proves too much proves nothing. Not only that, but if it means play an instrument of music, a man-made instrument, it would mean every member has to bring in an instrument in here, the guitar or whatever, and pluck the strings of it. No, it's not going to satisfy the command to have one person up here doing it. The command is only satisfied when each of you sing and make melody with your heart. So that's why the word is translated, make melody. It could be translated, pluck the strings of, but that would be kind of confusing, so they translated, make melody in your, or with your heart. That make sense, Karen? All right, so that argument by the Christian church was dropped. They quit talking about it. Then they said, well, it's just an aid. It's just an aid. It just helps us in our singing. Remember, that's what happened in Midway, Kentucky. Well, our singing is deplorable. So we're going to go practice. We're going to practice. How do you get the pitch? Well, let's let Miss Bertha sit up there and tinkle the keys, and we'll find out how to get the pitch. And okay, just go along with this a little bit so we can kind of get on tune here. What's the problem with that, by the way? Number one, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. We're satisfying only the human ear. That's all we're satisfying. We're not even asking the question, what does God want? We're asking, what do I like to hear? That's what we're asking. I made this comment one time to Ira Rice, who is editor of Contending for the Faith, and he was in a family that sang quartet, singing a lot. But he didn't like it. And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't have said it. I don't know. But I says, I said all this quartet singing, all this kind of stuff like that, and everybody trying to get exactly their parts and all that, which I appreciate people trying to be correct in music. I think we ought to do that. But there's so much emphasis on it, I says, you know what? I wonder if God appreciates it as much as we do. He said, what are you talking about? I said, 4-part harmonies, quartet singing. I said, I just wonder if is that not more entertainment? He's like, I thought, well, he's going to put me in the paper on that one. But anyway, the point simply is, regarding aid, think about this. If we sing with the songbook, what are we doing? We're simply and only singing. If I sing sitting down on a pew, I'm only singing. If I'm singing standing up in a building, I'm simply only singing. These are aids. These are only aids. But if I sing with an instrument of music, I'm no longer just singing. I'm actually singing and playing, or singing along as someone else plays. That is not an aid. It is truly an addition to the worship, which is why they dropped that argument. Yes, ma'am. You know what? And that kind of goes back to what Betsy had to say. I hope everybody heard that. People that are playing the instrument, they're not participating in like, okay, I want to offer my heart to God and pluck the strings of my heart. They're too busy trying to get the music correct. Same thing with a band. Same thing. Now, I marvel when I visit worship services elsewhere. And by the way, I don't ever miss my own assembly to visit a service elsewhere. I remember one time I asked Mom, I said, I had a Catholic girlfriend or a Catholic friend. And she asked me to come. She said, well, will you have to miss your own service of the Lord? I said, well, she did it. She said, well, the issue is, I mean, I'm happy for you to go on a Saturday night, but you're going to have to miss your own services. You better think twice about it, because you're forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. I thought, I say that, okay, so, but I do visit sometimes for example, before I debated Chris, what was his name? Chris, it was about 25, 30 years ago. Anyway, debated Chris, Pentecostal preacher. I would go to his service several times. I went to his worship service at the United Pentecostal Church. I'd go like on Saturday, Friday night when he said, I want you to come over and hear me preach. I said, okay. So I went over there. I thought, there's only one thing that strikes me. I said, this is nothing more or less than entertainment. It's all that it is. They're just playing the band. They're striking up the beat. They're getting everybody into it. And people start dancing around the building. Matter of fact, the women kicked their shoes off, ran around their stocking feet around the building. They just ran. I thought, what in the world? I've never seen this in my life. And then they came down, the women one side, men on their side. They were jumping around. I saw. I talked to Chris later. Says, how is that worshiping God? How would that be participating, as you mentioned, for people who are actually playing the music? They're trying to play the music. They're trying to figure out what's going on here and play the right chords or the right keys, whatever. That's not worshiping God. He's not asked us to do that. I said, nor is it worshiping God for me to sit here and listen to it. But that's what's going on in denominational churches, and unfortunately in the Church of Christ right now. People listen to music and they say, I'm worshiping God. No, you're not. It's not listening, it's not worshiping. Yes, sir. That's exactly right. That's exactly how they did it when Micaiah came into King Ahab's court. It's exactly what was going on. They were swirling around, they're jumping around. Micaiah put horns on his head, or not Micaiah, but rather Zedekiah put horns on his head, ran around, and they were just running around the building. That was what they were doing. That's how they behaved. The point simply being regarding aid, it's not an aid, it's an addition. It actually is an addition. You cannot sing plus an instrument and it comes out singing only. It is an addition, something else. So the Christian church defenders of instrumental music have dropped all of that. And now they say, well, there's no pattern. It doesn't matter how you worship. God doesn't care about it, just as long as your heart's all right. And it doesn't matter what you do. All right, what about that? Well, I'm going to tell you something. Our brethren frequently are right there. That's basically the attitude of a lot of Christian people. I'm talking about members of the Lord's church in Wichita Falls. Their idea is basically that. It doesn't matter what you do, just as long as your heart's all right. That is what this argument is all about. That is to say, there's no pattern. It doesn't matter what you do. So they say, well, there's no right and wrong way. Let me just play the devil's advocate here. There's no right and wrong way. There's nothing right. You're once again falling into the trap of saying there's something right and something wrong. You know what? And I'm glad you mentioned that passage. Let's look at two more that dovetail with that particular right there. He mentioned Philippians 3. Paul says, where Paul is speaking about, I'm going to give you a pattern here. Let's look at Romans chapter 6. verse 17. Just to give you a backdrop to this, in liberal papers put out by professors in Church of Christ colleges, they tell us there's no pattern in the New Testament. One paper said, and I'm going to quote exactly, pattern theology is not supported linguistically in the New Testament. What does that mean? Pattern theology is not supported linguistically. What does that mean? The words of there's no words in the New Testament that support the idea that you people have that there's a pattern. All right, so I run as fast as my little legs can carry me to Romans 6 and verse 17. Thanks be to God that whereas you were servants of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that, what's the word there? Form. And if you have a footnote, the same mean is or pattern. There's a pattern. A form, the word is form, mold, or pattern. There's a pattern of teaching that they obeyed to become a Christian. So first of all, we're not talking about worship right here, but we are talking about, let's just stop and think. What is it that causes people to say there's no pattern in the New Testament when Romans 6 says there's a pattern and you're obedient to a pattern to come into Christ? You'll obey a pattern. I'll tell you what it is. It is blinded by Satan is what it amounts to. They're blinded by their own desires. Let's look at one more text. That's 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 13. They had all the teaching out there. Paul said to Timothy this. Last letter that Paul ever wrote, right here. He's 3 chapters away from finishing his life. He says, I want you to hold the pattern of sound words. Sound words can also be healthy teaching. No pattern. That's the very word here. Pattern, fold, or mold, a form. That's the very word here. Hold the pattern of sound. The teaching is a pattern. And we are to worship, of course, by the teaching of Christ. There's a pattern. There's a pattern for everything that we have in the New Testament. Has God decided to leave it on to us to decide how we come into Christ? How we are to approach the throne of God? Or is He leaving it to us how to pray? Does He not give us a pattern for how to pray? How to sing? Why would these passages be in the New Testament if they're not to be used as a pattern? Yes, sir. The 2 Peter 1, everything, we have all that we need for life and godliness. It's all been given. And it was never in the New Testament. So, instrumental music, I'm going to summarize it here. We have one more minute remaining. Unless you wanted to add something or subtract or ask something. Yes, ma'am. You know what? That's a good point. How are other people going to know? Number one, I'm going to say this, and this may be harsh. Maybe it's too harsh, I don't know. I'm going to say that if you took a poll of members of the Churches of Christ in North Texas, most people would say there's nothing wrong with instrumental music. Nothing at all wrong. I'm talking about in the Churches of Christ. Why don't they do it then? Because it would upset the older members and they drive them outdoors. And they follow tradition. We're just doing a tradition. We know that because I know some song leaders in Wichita Falls in the Churches of Christ who also play in bands in the Pentecostal church. That's right. Well, North Richland Hills is and Fort Worth, they've already gone that direction. That's right. So we're simply repeating history, but you're right, Karen. We need to not only do it, but we do it not simply because of tradition, man-made tradition. We do it because of the tradition of the apostles. Yeah, that's right. And you're exactly right, though. Any other comment to make? Any other thought? Okay, let's take a break. Thank you for your participation.